Okay, so I think people are starting to log on, so we can officially start with D&I Honest Talks, the first honest talk ever, this time about mental health in the workplace. I am incredibly excited and honored to have Bessie, Kay, and Luciana with me today, who are leading experts in the field of diversity inclusion and who also have a lot to share about mental health. So the goal of the event is basically to change the taboo and to talk about mental health. Like a lot of times we don't do that either privately but also in the workplace. So this event is both for you, kind of if you're in a HR function or a company owner or in any kind of people function in a company, but also if you're someone who, for example, is stressed by the current situation or has ever struggled with mental health. Just to give a few words about how this event came about, actually, I started talking to Bessie in February about this, so very long before we knew what would happen about the lockdown and the ensuring really extraordinary circumstances. The perspective I'm coming from is as a human resources professional, so I know what it's like to be on the company side. I mean, obviously, as a commercial enterprise, yes, you want the people to be well, but you also just want business to function. So often, mental health is seen as this risk factor, and we will say a lot about that, kind of, and the misconception of that. And then personally, I have been kind of struggling and overcoming anxiety and depression. There was really a time when I kind of slept 4 or 5 hours a night. I really had kind of the same really worrying thoughts, like, I don't know how to do this, I don't know what to do. And it was actually a very lonely time, and there was not so much information, and I didn't know who to turn to. So this is also very important to me from a personal side. So I would say paying shared is paying half, and then you get lots of takeaways. This is really an event that kind of I'm putting together with these three amazing ladies for everyone who's watching to benefit. So please ask the questions in the chat. If you don't want to put the question in the chat, then message me privately either here or on LinkedIn. And also give yourself permission to be fully present. I'm guilty of that myself, that I kind of start checking emails and look on my phone. But I think it's really important at this time to focus on our mental health. So please do give yourself permission to do that. It's a safe space, so if you're writing in the chat, let's treat each other with respect. Obviously, sexism, racism, transphobia, ableism, or any form of aggression is not tolerated. This will be recorded, and I will be sharing the recording via my LinkedIn. And also, this is the discussion from a DSI perspective. It's not medical advice. So if you have a mental health condition and it's untreated, or you feel like you're really stressed and you need help, then please do get the help that you need. Okay, all right. So I would say let's start. Vessi, could you introduce yourself? Like, what's your story around mental health, and also what's kind of the connection to the work that you do these days?
Big questions. I'm not sure which one is the bigger one. I'll try to limit to a few minutes, so feel free to help me shorten the intro. Gosh. Well, about 3 years ago, I was my ex and I were planning to get married, and but instead we separated. And at the same time, I met Zainab, my partner, and that was a really challenging time where I felt, I guess, betrayed, disappointed. There was a lot of grief over expectations, things that, like, I don't know, getting married, having kids, things that were very much planned. I was angry. So all of that on the one side, and then on the other side, I was so happy, so excited, super energetic. And typically we don't experience those emotions at the same time. So it was a bit of a it felt pretty overwhelming, and it was really hard to talk to people about it, because I think many of them just saw it as like, oh, this is like rebound relationship or something like that. In reality, my previous relationship was more like codependent, and the new one was like, oh shit, that reminds me of who I am. That I'm actually about all of those great things. And I knew it wasn't a rebound. So it was a very transformative moment when I lost some friendships. I made some new friendships. But it was extremely challenging. So the grief was extremely deep because the relationship was 8 years long, and the new relationship was very exciting. So I could barely work for months. Like I would like go to work at 11 and maybe leave at 4-ish. And I didn't want to screw up the new relationship with having all of this going on. So I started going to therapy. And that was a really great decision. And later on, I continued to go. When I started my own business, Bessie.com, diversity and inclusion consulting, I was like, you know what? The thing that will make or break this business is not my skills for network. It's, like limiting beliefs that I have. So mental barriers. And I was like, obviously when you start the business, you don't have all of the resources in the world. You're not like, I'm not planning to have any revenue for a very long time. You try to cut on your costs, but I was like, no, I actually need to invest in this. And the more I was going deeper into my own personal journey, I was talking more to companies how they approach mental health, and it very much came together. So a big theme in my 2020 diversity in the workplace report that I published in February, people can check it out on Bessie.com, was one of the biggest topics there was about an intersectional approach to diversity and inclusion through mental health. Because very often in diversity and inclusion, we're like, oh, okay, like I'm this way and this person is, another way, like white, black, gay, straight, whatever, men, women, non-binary, etc. And we see people in those like little pockets, but the uniting thing is like we're all human and we all have mental health, and we should all be looking after our health. And that could be not just an intersectional approach towards mental health, different employee segments, just different people have different challenges, but we all need to look after this. And I think it's a great way to feel united and to have more empathy towards each other.
Yes, 100% agreed. Thank you so much for sharing that story. I think there was a lot of personal details, a lot of emotion, and I think it's very courageous to kind of share that on screen, and then also kind of to make that into a business and kind of to really go out there and inform people. So thank you so much for being here today, Bessie.
Pleasure.
Great. Yeah, so I would say let's just continue straight with the next attempt. Let's come to Kay. Kay, could you introduce yourself and what's your story about mental health in the business that you're doing these days?
Absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing, Bessie, and thank you, Miriam, for putting this together today. My name is Kay Fabella. I'm originally from Los Angeles. I'm Filipino-American. I have called Spain home, which means we're now in the same time zone. So I've been here since 2010. And mental health is an incredibly important topic to me for a couple of reasons. Obviously, on a personal level, as someone who experienced burnout very early in her career at age 22, and as a professional who works with a lot of leaders from underrepresented or historically marginalized groups who often suffer in silence when they experience bias or discrimination and have trouble putting themselves out there at work. So I will say this, though, I approach the conversation with diversity and inclusion with an American lens, being based in Europe, so quite intersectional, to build off of what Bessie said. And I've realized that many minority leaders that I work with don't necessarily have equal access to mental health, especially due to cultural stigma, due to systemic issues, due to social inequities. And if we're talking specifically against the backdrop of this pandemic, which is affecting all of us in different ways, minorities tend to be overrepresented on the front lines as essential workers, which obviously has an impact on their communities and obviously from a mental health standpoint. And I would say on a personal note, the reason why mental health is important for me, as I kind of touched on earlier, is I learned very early on what can happen if you take it for granted. And so it's so crazy to imagine a different recession now, but I graduated in the midst of the Great Recession in 2008 from university, right in the middle. And I was able to find a paying job, whereas many of my classmates, you know, they were taking on even more student loan debt to, you know, apply for master's degrees and hope to write it out, or they were moving back in with their folks because they couldn't find a job anywhere. And so as someone who was able to find a paying job, you know, I think there was a lot of insecurity I already had in the workplace, and severe imposter syndrome, which I think is something we can all relate to. And so as a combination of those things, I took it upon myself to try and make myself indispensable to my job, I guess. And I volunteered for every extra project that I could. And I was working anywhere from 50 to 70 hours a week, sometimes on weekends. And I didn't really even know who I could speak to. You know, when I started to feel the stress and anxiety piling up, I don't think I even had any of the mental health vocabulary that we have today. So even though I was, you know, unable to sleep or to function when I was finishing work, I just kept pushing myself because I didn't really know any better. And I think I remembered it all came to a head one day when I woke up on a Saturday morning in August in 2009. And I called my parents after having cried straight for 4 hours and saying, "Mom, Dad, I have no idea why I can't stop crying. What's wrong with me?" And that began a year-long battle with clinical depression. So with therapy and treatment, and obviously I love that Miriam said at the beginning, this is obviously through the D&I lens. And if you are, you know, in a position that's precarious, please do seek help. I know it helped me a ton. Therapy and treatment I had access to. And although I still live with, you know, depression and anxiety today as a business owner, especially as a business owner, I think you have the ups and downs. I'm privileged that I do get to determine my own schedule now. I now have the resources and the support group that I need to be able to manage it whenever I have my ups and downs, and a mindset that I'm very grateful for now that I probably didn't have then, which was that my mental health must be protected at all costs. So I know that mental health is slightly less taboo than when I joined the workforce in 2008, especially now with everyone being affected by COVID-19. But I think a big part of why I wasn't able to come forward when I first started to feel the stress and anxiousness at work was because I think not only wasn't there not the vocabulary yet, but there was also what I think we talk about a lot in the D&I space around culture fit at companies. So I saw everyone working really hard, if not probably even harder, with really crazy workloads. And that was just the culture, right? So I wouldn't even know who to talk to. I didn't know, you know, who I could lean on. And I think I was more concerned with and getting the job done than actually, you know, being perceived as, oh, I'm too weak to hack it, or I don't feel like I can admit this, and without some sort of, you know, repercussions for that.
Yeah.
I'm really excited about that conversation, especially with what's happening, and I'm excited to be here with you all today.
Great, thank you so much. I mean, also thank you for sharing your personal story around it. I think what you said was really powerful, also kind of connecting it to the work you do these days. And I think especially the point around the language, you know, that when we don't know how to talk about it, we don't. So let's come back to that point later. And then I'm super excited to also welcome Luciana. Would you also present yourself? What's your story and kind of what's the connection to the work you do these days?
Thank you, Miriam. Very, very happy to be with you today. So, well, 5 minutes is a really short time to sort of delve deep into both the professional and personal journey with mental health, but I'll try to be brief. So I'm Brazilian, and I guess I could consider myself an immigrant. Moved to Portugal when I was 13, and was very hard on myself my whole life. I usually say I lived a life of shoulds So you went to school, went into to do a law degree at Cambridge, and then afterwards did a business degree, international business degree. Sort of was on what the traditional path of what was expected of me. And at the time, at the age of 23, I sort of experienced what I call my quarter life crisis, which was the culmination of understanding, one, that I was living a life almost like I was a puppet of the cultural, the familial, social and professional expectations of what I should do with my life, which was also a huge turning point in my personal life, which was when I fell in love with a woman, and it was something that was not accepted in my culture and in my family. So all those two things combined led me to have a complete sort of, I battled with depression, and actually with a debilitating eating disorder from the age of 17. And at that time, once I finished my multiple degrees and found myself, one, kind of unexcited about the job force and what I was going to do as a next step, because I've always been very entrepreneurial. I actually was in mental health treatment in a facility for eating disorders and clinical depression for the greater part of a year. And having gone to a point where I didn't really see what I was in the depths of darkness, and sort of I had no real understanding of how I could get out of it, and actually of what my future was going to look like if I was going to have a future. And I think it's something that not many people can really understand, and I try to show that to you through my words. But it is a kind of influence. Getting to where I am now, it seems like that was a lifetime ago. So I having recovered and having had a couple of epiphanies that were largely driven by the people in my life. So that's why I'm so empowered by community and meaningful connection. I got to the point that I realized I needed to break free of those chains of what was expected of me, and sort of leapt into a career, 7 to 8 years of working with startups, wearing many different hats, where I almost, it took my life as a lab, where I did digital marketing. I became a certified ethical hacker. I launched a cybersecurity company, which then failed because of co-founder disputes. I then went on had a massive entrepreneurial journey, which then culminated in finding one of my passions is the immersive tech space. And that was largely driven through its application within psychotherapy, psychology, and psychiatry. But fast forward, the next 3 to 4 years, I have 3 pillars of what I do. One is future tech, immersive tech, always driven with tech for impact and how we can best use technology to understand ourselves. So we're always kind of bringing back to the psychological space. The other thing is diversity and inclusion. So I'm on a board of a series of LGBTQ charities and networks, very passionate about role and visibility and being an active advocate for both of all elements of diversity and inclusion. So I'm also Latino, so there aren't that many Latinos in tech. So I usually say I check all the boxes. And now I'm very tanned, so I'm kind of, of color. And also coming to mental health. I had at the beginning of last year, co-founded a company with also my cousin who's got generalized anxiety disorder, battled with it for many years, and is an organizational psychologist. And we started with a passion project, which was essentially helping people better understand their levels of stress, anxiety, and depression. So that's a project called Mind Check. And very briefly, over 6 months, we had over 10,000 people a month coming to the website, completing the test with a 70% conversion rate. And the hardest part and the catalyst for both of us to leave our jobs and dedicate our lives to this and our full time to it was 91% reported extreme to severe levels of poor mental health. And that after the last 6 months was actually validating what we could do to better support them. My understanding, especially given my history with eating disorders, is that it's not only, like Vessi said, we all have mental health, but it's mental and physical health shouldn't be separate. We have health, we all have health. And actually our physical and our mental are one and the same. So
Yeah.
we have a B2B platform for businesses to better understand holistically their levels of mental health. And we help them on that journey.
I totally, yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I mean, also your personal story. As I said before, I mean, there's so much courage, like in everything you shared with us, and kind of everything you've kind of overcome and are overcoming, and how you're using your tech knowledge to kind of create that into a platform for people to kind of really take care of themselves, and for businesses to take care of their people. So yeah, I mean, I'm super excited to have you and also Bethy and Kay, all of you here today. So, I mean, obviously this is a webinar, so we can't go kind of and like talk to the audience apart from the chat. So what I would like to do is kind of share something with you. It's a mood light. So basically what this is, it's in the chat box now, so you can click on it and share the mood that you're feeling today. So please be very honest with that. And I would like to ask everybody who's online and attending at the moment to do that. So, I mean, A, because I really want to know, like, how's everybody doing who's attending this webinar today? And also B, this is like a super helpful tool for you and your teams, for example, to do it at the start of a meeting. See, there's a lot of results coming in. Like, some people are feeling really optimistic and happy, and some are more worried and tired and exhausted. And what I thought is that we'll just do a tiny breath exercise. So, I mean, even if you just take one thing out of this webinar, and I know you'll take a lot more, but let's just do this together, that we do kind of a little breath exercise. And whenever you are in a space where you don't feel so good, for example, you said you're worried, you're exhausted, you're stressed, then please do this. So the way it works is that we count 1, 2, 3, 4 on breathing in. Then we hold it on 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we breathe out. Start that. So we start breathing in 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold 2, 3, 4. Exhale 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And again, inhale 2, 3, 4. Hold 2, 3, 4, and then exhale 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And one more time. Inhale 2, 3, 4. Hold 2, 3, 4. Exhale 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. How's everybody feeling now? Did that kind of change a little bit? Okay, I'll stop sharing the screen now. And again, like, come back to this exercise really whenever you can. Okay, let's jump straight into the questions. So the first question to everybody would be really to kick off, like, why is mental health in the workplace so crucial?
Where to start? I mean, there's the obviously the ROI argument. So the most recent Deloitte report from January 2020 is that every pound invested in the UK in employees' mental health equals £5 unlocked in productivity and employee well-being. So the argument from an economic perspective, which it's, I guess, a part of the conversation that we lead with when speaking to C-suites and leaders, is that you've got a clear cost benefit from investing in employees' mental health, and ultimately, your people are your organization. I think that's the most important thing for you as a company right now, is to safeguard and to distinguish yourself, especially during the pandemic, from those in your industry. It's no longer a checkbox exercise like diversity and inclusion. It is something that needs to be taken seriously.
I I totally agree. And I mean, what you're saying is so valuable, especially about the cost factor, because a lot of times the company may be kind of, I don't know, hesitant to invest money in it. But I mean, what you just shared, it really, really makes sense to take that money. So Vessi and Kay, could you share also what's your perspective on this?
Yeah, like in 2019, when I was publishing the first edition of the report, I was asking the different companies to select the areas of interest or areas where they have activities in the space of D&I. And mental health was in 12th position, so quite low, because there may be like 14 or 15, almost the last one. At the start of the year, it was in 7th position, which is quite a jump in a year's time. And just recently, like working with clients, it's in the last couple of months during lockdown and just after lockdown, it's number 1. So working with clients where 75% of the employees, not HR, of the employees are saying that mental health is an area of interest to them. Of course, we see remote working is also much more interesting to them, but that's unheard of. Like number 1 position, typically we see like gender, blah, 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 the things we expect to see as the leading areas of interest or relatable areas of interest. But 75% of employees is absolutely, I think, stunning. And what Luciana was saying, we can no longer think about, is this something we want to do? I don't think we're at a stage where it's a differentiating factor. It's very much becoming a must. And, Kay spoke about burnout. People have been burning out for years, but especially now, we see whole teams that are absolutely burned out, and it's actually shocking. You're like, wait, is the software working correctly?
Yeah.
And then, for example, I use Moonlight for so many of the workshops and webinars, when we typically see a lot of green, a lot of yellow. A lot of people are in the yellow area. We see like red colors, so red would be around anxiety. Yellow is around excitement. Green is around calm, content, hopeful. We see loads of blue now, which is when we're closer to burnout, when people were exhausted, depleted, tired, and they lose a sense of hope for the future. And this is something that people cannot manage just on their own. Not that people shouldn't do something on their own, but the role of the employer is extremely important, because if there is no understanding that your human capacities to deal with things, just your capacity to homeschool, get groceries, just get out of bed in the morning, look after your parents or whatever it is, and do your work. Like we need to make some adjustments, and I think it's high time that the leaders step in. They not only provide compassion and trust, but also support and stability, things that are really missing right now. And one of the ways is to be understanding and like maybe use tools like Moonlight or like Mind Check to see what's the extent that depression is, to what extent it's present among your team. Sure, there is a lot of anxiety, but I think there was so much anxiety for so long and people were basically in survival mode for 2 months, that now we're very much on the depression side, burnout, and people are kind of struggling. It's like things are back to normal, but they're not. And then we deal with self-isolation syndrome, which is a separate topic.
Yeah, I agreed with you. Like everything you say, that we can kind of see it on the rise during these times, and that it's also really the company's responsibility to kind of step up and make sure, because especially what you mentioned, like less boundaries between home and work. So yeah, that is hugely really relevant. And then Kay, also, what would you contribute?
Yeah, I would say absolutely what Luciana and Bessie were saying. I think that in the diversity and inclusion space, we always talk about bringing your whole self to work. Well, this is a very, very kind of violent part of that exercise. We're being thrust into each other's homes in a really, kind of expansive way, right? So I think what I'm seeing, so I hosted an executive roundtable with representatives from Amazon and Google and Tesla, among others, at the end of April. And you found that, well, one, what I thought was really interesting is a lot of those tech companies actually, as soon as the WHO announced it was a pandemic, sent their folks home. They're like, people, be safe, especially because as a lot of their, Silicon Valley headquarters were starting to be affected, they were like, we need to make sure our people are taken care of. So on top of that, they're making sure that not only are we thinking of the return to work and the clarity around that, but also what are we thinking about in terms of how do we use our existing ecosystems to make sure that people are supported? So coming back to what I was saying earlier about underrepresented groups, especially in the US, we have all these conversations in the US specifically around racial and social inequities. And so a lot of those conversations, a lot of those gaps, which we've been trying to kind of beat our drum on for years, and they're all siloed conversations, are not really being had in an intersectional way until now, because now you see, I was floored when I heard that over 42 million Americans don't have access to broadband internet. So even if you are working for one of these companies and you're being asked to work from home, you're not going to do so equitably, right? And then you add to that, how much further you are away from the workplace sort of standard of straight white man, keep moving further and the inequities pile up, right? So I think that when you add the mental health aspect of the fact that every single person is now showing up as their full selves, you are seeing caregivers and that responsibility, you're seeing the fact that most of the caregiving and the housework still falls on women, is almost expected to fall on women in the house. You're seeing, all of these different things that we're going through a collective trauma. Absolutely, 100%, which I feel is very timely for this conversation around Mental Health Month. But we're also going through such individual levels of trauma that we're seeing the inequities even in that experience. If you're able to have an Amazon delivery reach your home, or you have a pantry where you can fill it with extra goods, that's something that not everybody has access to, right? So I think when we're approaching mental health, and kind of to, pull a thread through what the other ladies have been saying, it's how do we make sure that we are continuing to prioritize our people, but also how are we continuing to meet them for their individual needs where they're at in an intersectional way?
Yeah, totally agreed with you. And I think it's such an important point that you're emphasizing, how kind of not everyone has the same access to resources that we would probably not even think about as like special. I think there's a lot of privilege. I know that some people get very itchy when you're talking about privilege, kind of, but what I think what that term means is just things that we kind of take for granted. So, for example, something like what you mentioned, Kay, the internet. That is a privilege in a way that kind of not everybody has that at home, and we don't think about it. So, I would just say, jumping from that point, and staying with your perspective, Kay, what you mentioned about especially taking the intersectional approach. So, from you and also from the D&I perspective, what's the impact of kind of the stress of maybe feeling or not feeling included at work, and kind of how do factors like race that you mentioned, for example, people of color, I think minorities, how does that influence our mental health at work? Like, if you could, and maybe also what can we do to kind of protect that, both as companies and as individuals?
Absolutely. So I think within the context of the pandemic, and especially, kind of taking conversations that I'm having with clients, like in this roundtable I hosted, psychological safety was number one. So I'm not surprised by Bessie's results of number 12 going up to number one. It's a concern. It's absolutely the number one concern I'm talking about with people, especially, big tech firms that have global workforces, because they know even across different countries, they're having different experiences, right? So they're really focused right now on how can we continue to take care of people and who are all going through this a strange situation, but going through it in different ways. And I would say this is even more pronounced for folks from underrepresented groups who already struggled with equity, with visibility around, their own day-to-day struggles with bias and discrimination before we were even working remotely. And, in some cases are continuing to do so. Obviously, Black and Brown communities are being impacted by this virus in the US, and I suspect in other parts of the world as well. And, you know, I would say as somebody who identifies Asian American, I myself have been on the receiving end of xenophobia related racial slurs. So, you know, it's fun. So one of the things I often talk about with clients, especially when I'm working with other people like me who are, you know, minority leaders or are physically identifiable as minority leaders, I would say, is this idea that we can't be what we can't see. Because if you come from a group that doesn't necessarily have access to generations of role models who look like you or who live like you or who you can kind of see your experience related back to you in, there's often this extra heavy burden of imposter syndrome because you look around and you think, wow, like I'm the only one in my community here. And you don't know who to turn to for mentorship or guidance or even that feeling of psychological safety to begin with. So I think that you know, there's a high likelihood even on top of that, if you come from a culture, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, Luciana, if you come from a culture where you're not allowed to talk about when things go wrong, you're often saddled with this pressure to overperform to prove that you need to be there. And so you don't think that you can even talk about or ask for help. So there's all these different layers and subtleties and nuances that I think add even more to the conversation around mental health and how do we support people from different ethnic groups or people of color or people from, you know, physically identifiable minority groups.
And I mean, thank you for also sharing all these insights. And I think it's also very, very important, for example, what you mentioned that you did experience, for example, racial slurs in workplaces, because, for example, as a white person, probably a lot of people think like, yeah, but that doesn't happen in my workplace. You know, like my first kind of impulse was to be like, yeah, that would never happen in one of the companies where I worked in. But seriously, if you don't belong to a minority, you would know because those would be directed at you. So I think that's also very powerful of, you know, like sharing the different experiences and kind of trying to be aware of what we don't see. Yeah. And then maybe I think because Kay already kind of handed the word to Luciana, maybe you want to kind of jump in with your perspective in that. And then also because I know that you're very vocal about also the way we talk about this. So maybe kind of to elaborate on the difference between mental health and mental illness and like what's the danger of confusing it and if there is actually danger.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think like you touched upon, it's of and by the way, I keep getting sidetracked with the chat. Kristen and is doing an incredible initiative putting together psychological first aid trainings. Now, I'd love to follow up on that and chat to you about what we're doing for essential workers and healthcare workers around kind of trauma, PTSD. But going back to our discussion on, I think coming from a culture where there are a lot of expectations and restrictions on, you know, it's like paradoxical. Growing up in Brazil, which is a very emotive culture, very Latino culture, there's what I see is still there's very ingrained unconscious biases in the sense of a man and a woman are this. That's something that I also realized growing up. I had those biases, which was something that's very difficult for me. And you know, now identifying as a very proud lesbian, it was. But then in talking about that with companies, we really understand that we need to have that vulnerability, and we strive for that vulnerability, not just from employees, but also from leadership, from C-suite, and showing up and saying those things that are very difficult to say, particularly as we're working remotely. I think if you're someone like me and like many of you in the audience who have touched upon burnouts and the increased pressure that we put on ourselves, which is also the increased pressure that society puts on us, you know, regardless of industry. I think having been through coronavirus, so I had that I had the virus 2 months ago, and I found myself within the first kind of 2 or 3 weeks still feeling a need to be productive, a need to go back to work, a need to produce and to do, and to constantly feeling pressure also from working in the space of mental health and of diversity and inclusion, of change consultancy, and wanting to support organizations. But it's, Vessi and I run workshops around mental health, and we often refer to, you can't pour for an empty cup. So it's important that we bring back that conversation to that not only companies recognize the importance of, like Kay very beautifully said, that we meet our people where their individual needs are, but also that we're able to have that emotional, mental awareness, so that we ourselves recognize what our boundaries are, and also adopt the kindness that we need to show to ourselves. And that's something that for me was very difficult at the start, even though, I kind of live and breathe mental health and have 17 plus years of psychotherapy. But it is something that is very difficult for you to do, and recognize that you need to show that kindness. Last week was Mental Health Awareness Week in the UK, and actually the theme, the topic was changed to kindness, because that's ultimately what we need to show ourselves the most. And it's very important. Kind of the head of D&I at Spotify, Cassiano, saw a post that he did today where, quite interestingly, as we touched upon privilege, but he's talking about the fact that he's quite secure in his position. He's got a paying job. He's thankfully didn't suffer any kind of health consequences from the virus. His family and friends are safe, and he's in London, in somewhere where he does have access to those things that typically we take for granted. And I think it's an important and interesting point for us to bring up, this idea of forced gratitude, that he was understanding that, he is very privileged, but he also found himself feeling overwhelmed, and at times feeling like, this is a lot, I feel emotionally drained. And it is a pandemic, and no matter how many of these psychosocial comforts we have, sometimes it's also understanding that this forced gratitude, it's okay in the sense that we need to understand how and accept and practice gratitude, but it's also okay to recognize, no matter all of that, it's okay to be overwhelmed, and to say, I will take the day off, and I will show that kindness to myself with the smallest of things.
Yeah. I mean, I would agree with you. I think it's so important in this conversation what you're saying, like that, of course, being grateful, but also being kind of, just being honest with not being okay. I think that is very, very important too. Also, just to be like, look, I'm not in the best mood. So yeah, thank you, Amy, for all those insights. And then maybe the next question, kind of to Vessi, and then obviously also to the others. I'm just kind of calling in you to make it easier to navigate. So, I mean, obviously we know that the workplace can be very meaningful, that can give us purpose, but it can also be really negative and induces stress. I mean, also what several audience members posted in the chat about the burnout. So, kind of, what have you discovered about the intersection of mental health and especially remote work environments, and maybe also what can we do to protect ourselves in that situation? So if you'd start, and then the rest can also throw in.
Wow. I think everyone is extremely challenged. Like, I have worked remotely for about 4 years, and a solo entrepreneur for about 1.5 years, and it's really, really hard to feel lonely and isolated, and people don't really understand it up until they're in this situation. So while I was working remotely, the first part of those 4 years, it was actually with a team. Everyone else was physically together, and sometimes, I don't know, they'll be celebrating a birthday, they'll call me for the birthday or whatever, say happy birthday, and they couldn't understand how actually isolating that could be. Or they will organize, let's say, a team building thing for them, and everything was reminding me that I'm not part of this. and they really couldn't wrap their head around it because it wasn't their experience, and they wouldn't know too many people going through this. I think now everyone being behind the screen, we become more compassionate to each other. At the same time, there are people who have been onboarded on new jobs in the last couple of months, and they really, really struggle. And while everyone is busy now, feeling isolated, lonely, frustrated, whatever, for working remotely, there is a lack of understanding for the depth of isolation that new joiners have in a company. And some of those are like the likes of big four, big traditional companies that are new to remote working, that are not necessarily open to emotional vulnerability. Like, you might actually be punished for sharing because it might be seen as a weakness. But we also see that in, tech companies that we consider very inclusive, very open-minded, just because people haven't had those experiences. So what can we do? I think on the employer side, it's never too much to reach out and ask people, hey, how are you feeling today? It's never too much. And when you're a new joiner, to really try to have those conversations, even if there are a couple of people on the team, or even just one person in the company, to catch up non-formally, like just informally, not about operational stuff, and to have some level of connectedness. So I was talking to a friend just a couple of days ago, who joined the new company, and what they were saying is that they don't really have any kind of context of how much are others struggling with the workload or with the difficulty of the new job. Are people, I don't know, talking to each other? So they lack any kind of benchmark to help them understand how they're doing. So sure, they're talking to their boss, they have met their team, but you can't be asking for validation every single day and be like, hey, how am I doing? Especially in a very demanding job, in a very competitive field. So how do you find the balance? And maybe part of it is if the organization doesn't feel psychologically safe to do that, and you don't feel like your manager has had such experiences in the past and will have the compassion, the understanding, to support you in a moment like that, maybe the way is to find others for new joiners in other companies, and just see that the tremendous imposter syndrome is absolutely natural right now, and try to normalize it for yourself and be gentle and kind to yourself. Like, you know what, if you're not doing enough and you get fired for that, actually maybe they expect way too much. And it's not the whole responsibility purely only on you to be a successful employee. And I think that's the case in general. Being a successful employee takes both sides.
Yeah, totally agreed. Totally agreed. I mean, it kind of, the better you have your people supported, the better they will be. And I think what you also said was very powerful about just like reaching out in the personal contact. I think this is so underestimated. And then especially kind of, if you don't know if your manager is a safe person to talk to, then yeah, do find other people. That is so true. I mean, the next question would be kind of, okay, you've already touched on this about that some workers have the double burden. And I also read in the chat that one of our participants, for example, has experience with being a caregiver and kind of being an employee. So how can workplaces support employees that have these challenges?
I think, well, first off, I really wanted to just underline Bessie's much needed perspective. I think that people are really focusing on their current people and environments, but they're not remembering that companies are still hiring in the midst of this. So what does that look like? So I really appreciate you sharing that perspective. I think that when it comes to, caregiving specifically, I think it's something that it's such an invisible burden, especially because a lot of that falls on women, that now it's very much thrust into the spotlight, because I've seen parents turn into human jungle gyms with their kids climbing on top of them on video calls. And I think that what companies can do, what I loved about one of the companies that I'm engaging with right now, they said, well, we've been doing remote for a while, but now what we're trying to do is empower our middle managers to say, hey, it's okay if your kid comes on the call. Oh, who's that? Let them come in, so that they don't feel like this extra pressure of like, oh, I can't turn my video on because I don't want to be seen for my being less than perfect, which especially as women, I mean, I got all gussied up for y'all today because I really just was like, ooh, an excuse to put on a face. But I know that's not necessarily the case for, a lot of women who have to do a lot of covering. And so, for example, Black American women or Black women have to make their hair acceptable for a video call, right? So you look through all those different layers of how can you, empower especially middle managers who are now, their job was already hard. Now it's getting even harder because they have to handle mental health. They have to handle, different people with, especially people who are working from home with kids right now. Y'all, alongside essential workers, you need to have statues dedicated to you, because I don't know how you're doing homeschooling and, making sure that your kids are fed and you're surviving and you somehow get wine in at the end of the day. It's amazing. But you get the middle managers, you have as much as possible to empower them with at least the permission, or giving them the permission slip of, it's okay to show up as your full self. We know that it's not perfect. We know that, you can't separate life and work right now. And so rather than me trying to force you into this pigeonholed and quite outdated workplace model of productivity and how you were supposed to look like at work, why don't we talk about how we can make it okay for you to show up as your full self, and make it less taboo for you to, have to, say, I'm having a hard time today. My kid is, being extra fussy. For one of my friends here in Spain, we were on a very strict lockdown for 50 days. We weren't allowed to leave the house for an hour of exercise unless you were going to the grocery store, going to the pharmacy, or had a dog. I was very envious of dog owners. I have 2 cats. They weren't keen on leaving.
And I mean, jumping in there, I guess like everyone who has a kid at home, kind of just imagining 50 days of lockdown. Wow.
Exactly. I mean, one of my friends she has 2 girls who were 3 and 1.5, and both of them regressed, because they weren't, interacting with their friends at daycare. And so, the 3-year-old who used to have crazy temper tantrums all of a sudden was acting back up again. The 1.5-year-old was dealing with, basically she thought she was a baby again. So imagine what that looks like, and imagine how could you possibly expect your employees to show up if they're dealing with, I have to meet a deadline and I have to be presentable, but also I have to make sure that my family survives. And so I think it's empowering our leaders and empowering our culture to be able to handle the conversation in a more permissive way.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it is really like a culture change.
Yeah, I would add, I mean, on one hand, it's a question whether or not you saw any cultural differences. That I heard the other day that there was, depending on whether nationality, cultural differences in terms of showing more of your actual workspace versus being having to go into a place of your house that, I mean, at the moment I have my kitchen, but going to a space of your house where you don't show, because in that culture it's more of it's almost disrespectful to have a window into someone's home. So that's a question, and I would just add to what you were talking about. Also in the sense that I think for very young children, but also touching upon the different nationalities and different cultures, I think governments and school systems are not being equal in the way that they approach the schoolwork for, say, 8 sort of middle school and the equivalent of high school, and you see parents that are, I think in the UK, were essentially entrusted with being full-time teachers. They were given the materials, and it was a bit like, go. Whereas I see, for instance, here in Portugal, you've got more of there are things that have been digitalized, and there's teachers that are going on remote calls with the students. So that's an interesting thing when we're talking about inequalities as well, in the sense that if you've got a 12-year-old and you're certain, and suddenly you have to not only take care of your job and your house and your husband or wife and your work and your family, but also have to turn on your math teacher hats and science teacher hats and run science experiments and whatnot. I think that's kudos to you, and I think you also, you deserve a statue. It was a bit of a rambling on about it's of paramount importance that we've got leaders that recognize, middle managers, those in leadership that recognize that the physical impossibility of having to manage all those fronts.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, I guess it's a lot on everybody at the moment. Maybe I would ask kind of one more question, just to everybody, kind of, because I think there's different statistics, I think, from the World Health Organization, for example, that a third of us will kind of experience some kind of mental health challenge throughout the day. So kind of what can we do to balance our common stress?
Something that I only started practicing a week ago. I deal with a good amount of anxiety, self-doubt, and something that I learned recently, and I really really enjoyed doing it, that I want to share with you. So thinking of a moment when you have had unconditional love for yourself, and if possible to connect it with a place, a specific body, I don't know, feeling, temperature, whatever. So for me, it was last Wednesday. I was cycling in the park, and the combination of just my day and the warmth of the air, and in Dublin, so I'm based out of Dublin, Ireland, so it's not necessarily that warm every day, but the warmth and the energy of cycling, and I had just had a call with a friend, and I had been in therapy that morning, and it was, I don't know, I just really found like an unlimited source of unconditional love for myself. And I actually took a picture because I was like, I want to remember this moment and to be able to go back to it. And I think consciously capturing such a moment is really, really important, so we can go back to it when we feel extremely vulnerable or self-doubting ourselves.
Yeah, that's a beautiful.
With anxiety, I always go to play. It's my, whatever that means, cycling, or like, I don't know, playing with Lego, or just being silly on TikTok. And sometimes I feel confused. Like, what do I want to do? I will not get you too much into my anxieties, but let's say when I'm struggling with simple choices, I try to focus on what do I want to do that I can do. And I find that helpful because I'm getting out of the sense of confusion through desire, I guess.
Okay, so should we move on to the question of how we can influence leadership to learn about emotional intelligence, and actually implement in companies' cultures? It's a big one. That's a big one. I think we're seeing the job market shift, particularly when we think about AI and automation and tech. So I would venture to say those are the skills that we need the most, kind of mental and emotional resilience. You're back. I don't have a concrete answer to it in so far as what we're trying to do with Mindcheck is to help companies better understand the levels of individuals' mental health, so stress, anxiety, depression, and through that, get them to understand better the link between those levels of I guess poor good mental health and emotional resilience, emotional agility, emotional intelligence, and then how that directly links to performance. In the sense of influencing leadership, the way that we've approached it has always been kind of building the business case for. And I think that's that would be where what my thought is coming from. That we need to get them to understand kind of the business case, the benefits from a cost benefit analysis way of investing in emotional intelligence, and hopefully shifting L&D so that we're more and more incorporating soft skills as opposed to throwing employees into data analysis courses, but sort of nurturing that ability to be more aware of your mental and emotional state.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, I'm guessing. I think I heard Vesi's and Luciana's answer. I think you didn't, or did I miss that? If not, like.
No,
Okay, then
we
yeah.
just kind of said, oh, Miriam's gone. I guess we'll take Kim's question. It's really good.
Good, yeah, great.
Ooh, I see a book. I see a book. Hold on, I'm gonna mute myself so that Luciana.
Really obsessed with books. So this is the Emotionally Intelligent Office. It's a 20 key emotional skills for the workplace, and it's by School of Life. So that's something that is just it's been a really interesting read in telling you sort of the why, right, about these 20 skills, from self-awareness to purpose, to objectivity, to innovation, to empathy, and how those are can be implemented in the workplace. So to touch upon second.
Wow, that's a really, really valuable resource. You give us your perspective, and then we jump into the kind of closing takeaways, practical takeaways.
Absolutely. Actually, I wanted to bubble up what Kirsten said around combining head and heart. I think that Luciana touched on a very important topic, which is how do you build the business case, especially when we're talking about leaders, because they're still looking at bottom line, they're still looking at revenue, they're still looking at productivity and kind of traditional measures of success or markers of success. But I don't think business as usual will continue after this. It shouldn't. I heard a colleague the other day on a call I attended say, what if we looked at business as usual, BAU, as business as us? I think, employees and future employees are going to pay close attention to how tech organizations treat their people, coming out the other side of this as they decide where they want to work and who they want to work for, especially as we're seeing our expectations around company culture change, around what we expect of leaders and how they interact and engage with their employees. I think this idea of, it's something that I heard the other day that, these sort of corporate hierarchies or this pyramid or whatever it was, whatever shape you prefer, will be inclusive of all geometric shapes, is now been flattened. You're only a click or an email away from pretty much anybody in your organization right now. So leaders are increasingly expected to model this authenticity, to model this transparency in their communications in a way that we just weren't before, because you can't physically see each other in the office anymore. And so when we talk about, what is it going to look like after the crisis ends? What are the expectations now that, some people have been building this business case for flexible working for a long time, especially within the D&I conversation for years. And now we've all had a taste of it. Do we really want to go back to normal? So I think if you're going to be approaching your leadership to talk about this, it's really, really important to, yes, have the business case, but also remind them, this is what we expected of you during this time. This is what we expected of you during this crisis. And the leaders who did best, the leaders who maybe even gained in terms of performance or engagement or even just trust, which is something which is so, so important right now, even more so now when we don't see each other physically, are the ones who are going to succeed moving forward. So I think if you want to add an additional argument to when you have to, bring it forward to leadership, imagine, it's 2021 and 2022 and somebody's interviewing for your company, and one of the questions that they're asking you is, how did you treat your people during COVID-19? And they're going to remember. So might as well be on the right side of history, right?
Yeah, very, very, very true point that people do take care of that and pay attention to that. So I would say let's wrap up with your practical tips. The things, like, especially if people haven't played so far, maybe can you just give us a quick idea of, like, what can those people do to kind of encourage the play?
Well, I think it's a good idea to remind ourselves what we used to do as kids, and whatever it was, like maybe we're playing soccer, or we're cycling, or you would climb trees, or you would play with Lego, or you would read books, whatever it is, or just look at books with illustrations. I don't know, things that meant something to us at a specific moment of time, and we can reconnect with, I don't know, our inner child. Like, for example, I have this book here. It's about Ireland, and it's with beautiful illustrations, and even just having color at my desk, something colorful works for me to stay playful.
Yeah, I think those are really, really helpful ideas, and I will definitely take.
So I really love that Miriam asked each of us for our 3 tips. And so I think that as individuals, and this goes across the board, no matter where you are in the corporate hierarchy, if you're furloughed, if you're a freelancer, protect your mental health at all costs. I think, if there was ever a collective permission slip for us to take a break from things right now, it's now. What it'll look like after the pandemic, I don't know, but my hope is that people remember that it's okay to not be consuming content. It's okay to, take a break. It's okay to let someone know you're not all right and say, hey, I'll get back to you. I need a mental health minute, or I need a walk, or I just need a break. Whatever you need to do for yourself and do that gut check, especially now, is super critical. And just in general, moving forward, for you to, coming back to what Luciana and Bessie were saying of, you can't serve from an empty cup. So really fill up that cup as much as possible. For leaders, to kind of sum up what we've been saying a lot, empathy, humanity, compassion, we are all experiencing this differently, but by no means equitably or equally. So you don't know what's happening behind the camera, or in some cases, the Zoom backgrounds. So it's really important to remember that those different facets of identities and situations that you don't see are going to be different. So just imagine that you're connecting with humans first and foremost. And for organizations, I think, you already have Luciana here on the call for a perfect person to tap into this with mental health resources. Expand them, especially moving forward. We do not know how much this has affected us psychologically, but we're all going to experience something, and we're going to need help coming on the other side of this. So provide everyone that you can with the tailored support that they need, whether it's external providers or doubling down on existing trainings, making sure that you're empowering leaders and people across the spectrum with the tools and knowledge they need to support everyone at this time.
Oops. Thank you so much for these tips, Kay. And then I would hand over the mic to Luciana to share her tips.
Thank you. You said high tailored, personalized, holistic tools. So kind of top 3 tips was very difficult to get down. But I would say, particularly given recent experience, setting physical, mental, and emotional boundaries. For me, it's something we touched upon earlier in the webinar, not having either the being able to physically or emotionally or intellectually divide your work and life balance. When it comes to when those merge, physically, then we have to be extra aware of when work creeps into our lives and vice versa. So I would say, listening to your body, and importantly, like I touched upon, being kind to yourself. One thing that I learned very much, and I don't know if the ladies in the panel shared, and you folks at home, that if you've got a difficulty saying no, to things, particularly kind of solopreneurs or entrepreneurs tend to be overworked and overcommitted. One thing that has been really helpful to me is that internalizing that say a yes to something or someone is a no to something else. So having that in mind, and that you are choosing, and when you are choosing, choose wisely. Then in times of conflict, one thing that was very powerful and helped me, and if you haven't seen Brene Brown's A Call to Courage on Netflix, see that, is, and particularly when I'm seeing periods of high anxiety and you're suffering from the cognitive distortions, either black and white thinking or overgeneralization and whatnot, saying out loud the story either to yourself or particularly to someone else, and checking in and saying the story I'm telling myself is that, for imposter syndrome, for instance, is that I'm not good enough because of XYZ. Those are the things that your mind is telling you, and actually fact checking them and saying, actually, no, I've done this, I'm doing this, I'm on this webinar, I'm done this. So it's actually kind of checking in your mind versus facts. And then being aware of the 4 Fs. So I'm actually, to add to the book recommendations, I'm reading a book now called What Emotions Are Made Of. And it's very interesting in emotional theory. And she talks about kind of the biological evolution of emotions, how we still, even though we've got however many thousand years on this earth, our bodies react in the same way as our ancestors. So we've got those 3 Fs or 4 Fs, the fear, flight, fight, and freeze. And actually being aware of which one you naturally adopt in certain situations, as well as having counteracting them physically. So there's the Hendricks model that I've identified, those 4, and also if you tend to flight, for instance, adopting a grounding exercise where you physically stance, and those are, I'll share the link also on the chat. So those would be my top tips.
Yes, please do. I mean, thank you also for your amazing tips. I would also say, just based on everything that's been in the chat and that's been recommended, I will be very happy to kind of curate a list with everything that all of you recommended and then post it publicly so that everybody can participate in it and kind of share in it. And I will also kind of post the key points and takeaways. So thank you, Kay. Thank you, Vessi. Thank you, Luciana. It was really, really amazing having you here. And obviously also thanks for the audience. I really hope that this webinar brought you value, and that we'll just keep the conversation going on this. And I mean, also big thanks to Vessi for kind of accompanying me through until February till now to make this happen. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very, very grateful.
I'm very grateful to have all of you here.
Thank you for driving forward this conversation. It's definitely needed. We appreciate it.
Great. I so much appreciate all of you. Thank you. And then I would just say, let's wrap it up. We could probably talk about this for hours, but let's go. I mean, at least in Berlin it's sunny, so I go enjoy the sunshine. And thank you so much, all of you.